and hand over to you, Gordon.
Thank you, Jenny. Let me share my screen. Okay, this is completely unrehearsed, and I did go through on a previously recorded presentation, I think it was about 3 or 4 months ago, outlining some of the new features of the toolkit. So I'm not particularly going to reproduce that today. Let's log on. I guess the first thing is, this is just by way of breaking the ice, is just to point out that when you go to the Access RDA Toolkit web address these days, what you get is the new toolkit, which is now the official version as of January, the official version of RDA. For those of you who don't know, don't panic, the old toolkit is still here. But it's now available under the Resources tab, just above AACR2. It's part of a section of the Resources tab, which is really to do with old stuff, starting with revision history, the original toolkit, and AACR2 itself. So it's still there. And the RDA Steering Committee expects those individuals and organizations who are currently significant users of the toolkit to continue to use that older version. It's going to take time to reorientate staff, to redraft documentation, and most of all, I think, to look into the advantages that this redesign and redevelopment of the toolkit brings to the particular cataloging applications that you're engaged in. That's going to take time, and we have this roughly speaking 18-month window. The Library of Congress and the Program for Collaborative Cataloging, for example, have announced that they won't be formally using the instructions in the new toolkit until the middle of next year. So that's roughly 18 months. So that is the huge difference. This is the new toolkit. The old toolkit is now the old toolkit. Otherwise, we've had nearly 2 years to familiarize ourselves with the interfaces. The only thing I want to draw attention to, and this is a question that Jenny raised earlier this week, is what's happened to books of the Bible. So I'll nip that one in the bud immediately, because I know it's a burning question that's on every cataloger's mind. It was before the release you're seeing here. It came out under community resources and community vocabularies, and then there was a direct link to books of the Bible from this page. But the RSC has been discussing this for most of last year, what to do with these community resources. And in that last iteration of the beta toolkit, the 3R toolkit, there was a firm decision made to move everything under specific languages. So all of the previous content can now be found within these language terms. This is unfinished. All that's happened so far is this information has been restructured out of the original toolkit where it was scattered in various appendices and in the instructions. So it's all been brought together, but RSC is still working out the fine detail. It's by no means complete. If you're looking for books of the Bible in English, then you'll find it under English. And then eventually you will get to the old page here. This is deliberately rambly. Don't expect any direction in this. I'm completely extemporizing this. There's no rehearsal here. Some other things to notice are that the breadcrumb trail is pretty effective. So in something like this, which appears to be buried in the toolkit, in fact, you have a clear breadcrumb trail that gives its logical structure within the new toolkit. So it's a term in a specific language, terms in English, and then specific terms for books of the Bible. The other thing to point out is all of this works. So if you are working and cataloging a lot of religious material and you do need access to this on a frequent basis, you can bookmark it, or you can take a copy of the URL and you could create your own little web page that would give you the links to this kind of stuff that you need on a daily basis. That's the idea behind these bookmarks and links anyway. This will get developed over time, and I'm expecting in the end, and this is certainly what has been discussed with policy statement writers, that direct links to things like this in community vocabularies will eventually appear embedded in policy statements. And the policy statement is likely to be your primary prompt when carrying out daily cataloging, and therefore a direct link from a policy statement to these sections of the toolkit is likely to be extremely useful to people. That was one of our little questions. We have a set of prepared questions hidden in the background in case things flag. That was one of them, what's happened to the books of the Bible, but the same answer applies to those other resources that you might have spotted. What happened to the gender terms? They're here at the moment, collective titles, and those residual terms for medium of performance. All of this is likely to be reviewed, developed, etc., but it won't be done by the RDA steering committee. That was the big decision. This stuff is a mixture of legacy things left over from the Anglo-American focus of AACR2, mixed in with things that have cropped up over the years. They are all basically specific to one community and are only of interest to other RDA communities who happen to be cataloging what they would regard as foreign language materials. So terms in English is an extremely useful area for example, catalogers in China or France, where English is a foreign language, but they still have to catalog English language materials. The whole thing is symmetrical, and what you see in front of you is the English language treatment of so-called foreign language materials within the toolkit. That's the big difference between the, I think, September and December releases of the toolkit. There were some additions made to guidance that's been fleshed out in certain areas. There was also the addition of something that may be of interest to linked data communities and the Mark 21 communities that are recording URIs and IRIs. And that is to do with what we call the stringification of an IRI for use as an identifier. And I'm going to try and remember where that might crop up. Let's try carrier type. Must be somewhere else. No, I've lost it. I'll try and think about it. This is the result of not rehearsing properly. So there have been a number of small adjustments made. They're listed in the release notes for, let's have a look at this. The release notes for the 2020 December release. There are various bits and pieces. This is a huge range of granularity in these release notes, ranging from a single typo fix to a redraft of a whole instruction segment, for example. Yeah, I don't see it there, so I'll try and remember and come back to this later in the session. That's if anybody's interested in how you stringify an identifier. Apart from that, I don't really have much more to say. What I'm interested in is hearing questions and comments from the audience so that we can all discuss some of these new features, etc., of the new RDA toolkit. So at that point, I'll stop sharing my screen and let Jenny take over again.
Thanks, Gordon. Thurstan, you could join us again also. Thanks. Thurstan, this is actually yours, so I'm wondering if I should be reading it out. Would you like to share your favourite feature? You're muted.
Apologies there. Yeah, so in terms of my favourite feature is the fact that I'm able to search using mark tags or mark tags plus subfield values in the new toolkit search box, and then find all of the elements which reference that particular field or subfield. In the old toolkit, we had a set of tables containing mark mappings, which were available in the, I think it was the resources tab. But now it's far more granular in terms of the results that you get back when you search for a mark tag or subfield. And so, yes, that's, I think that's a significant improvement on what we had before.
Yeah. And I suppose since most of us do work in Mark, the question I've received here, how does do the new changes affect day-to-day cataloguing? Is pertinent there, because a lot of people will still be interested in how they fit their RDA cataloguing into Mark.
Mm-hmm. I think that in terms of the way in which the new RDA provides different recording methods at the element level, this, in terms of business as usual, to a greater extent, that can carry on as normal. But in terms of the potential for development beyond what we have now, into, for example, a linked data environment, the RDA toolkit is far more hospitable for allowing that development now. As regards Mark 21, one of the things that we've discovered is that in many cases it's possible to record an RDA element using one or maybe more than one different recording method, but not all of them. So one of the big questions that the Mark community is looking at present is whether to, beyond what is possible already in terms of recording something like an unstructured description or just structured description, do we want to also to be able to record identifiers and URIs as values for some of these elements? And if so, what changes are feasible within the context of the Mark 21 formats? Because that's another thing to consider. You know, the Mark formats are now over 50 years old, and in terms of what you find in Mark 21, many parts of the formats are effectively full. So it is quite a challenge in terms of determining what is possible for inclusion.
Yeah, let's not go down the Mark is dead discussion route today. I've had a request for the Mark tag searching to be demonstrated, and I think that we could do that, but we'll deal with that later, because I think we could get sidetracked too quickly onto just talking about Mark. Your mention of different recording routes is making me think of something I've long been interested in, which is I'm very happy to transcribe fields to record various manifestation statements, but I would also like it to be possible to record sort of clean information. So particularly for something like the publisher, publisher names come in so many different data text strings when it comes to transcription of the publisher name. So that if somebody says, can you get me everything that we've got by X publisher, you then have to jump through a ridiculous number of hoops to find that just by string matching on whatever's available in the relevant space in your catalogue. So the possibility of being able to do both of those things that RDA brings with its different recording methods, and you can apply whichever recording method is of interest for the relevant data element and or institution requirement, I really, really like. Gordon, do you want to say anything about how you think cataloging, day-to-day cataloging will be affected by the new changes?
Sure. There will be an effect. We knew that there would be an effect 10 years ago. This is not news. I'm talking about the treatment of aggregates, serials, and those parts of the original toolkit that had placeholders in them. There were placeholders for entities called object and event and things like that that were never ever added to. So anybody dealing in day-to-day cataloging of these areas, we knew that aggregates was poorly served by Ferber because the IFLA community itself couldn't come to an agreement on the treatment of aggregates despite a 5-year development project which they engaged in. With aggregates, IFLA said, do not, because of the controversy, do not do anything different, carry on the way that you have been until such time as the models are consolidated under the library reference models, it turned out. So I know these are huge areas. It's been stated elsewhere that virtually every published manifestation is an aggregate of one form or another. So you could say that everything has changed because the treatment of aggregates has changed. But in fact, when you look at the treatment of aggregates, including these aggregates that we're not really interested in as being aggregates, then the treatment has not particularly changed in the new toolkit. You can still do what you were doing before. The context has changed radically, however, and what you're doing, you may want to rethink in due course. So I'm talking about, again, serials and aggregates. If we look at serials, there's huge development going on at the ISSN Centre right now about the treatment of serials, and they've stated that they want to bring it into line with the library reference model and therefore to RDA, which already does that. Apart from these areas, however, the new entities, the detailed treatment of special aggregates, and the cataloging of serials, I don't see any reason why day-to-day cataloging should change radically, except for policy reasons. But there are no technical or professional reasons why there should be a huge change. The changes in context, the changes in underlying infrastructure and modeling, and the change to come in the future must surely be, and I think Thurston's alluded to this, changing and developing cataloging policies to better exploit RDA, and not just RDA, but the library reference model and these other changes I've been talking about, to better exploit those for the benefit of our applications and their users in due course. So the RSC has really tried very hard to end up in this situation where the past is no longer dragging us down. We can't change because it's going to take too much effort to change. RDA's broken free of that, but it hasn't thrown the baby out with the bathwater at the same time. So we're hoping, although it looks all terribly unfamiliar, that once reorientation takes place, that most catalogers engaged in day-to-day cataloging will understand that they're pretty well doing the same things, although their understanding of why they're doing it may have changed. So that's my long-winded answer to that, Jenny.
Thanks, Gordon. I would agree that while you're still cataloguing traditional materials in our traditional data entry setup, what you're going to end up with in terms of a bibliographic record is going to be very similar to what you would have done before. But it does make so much more possible in terms of how that can then connect to properly constructed linked data and the potentials therein. I have a comment here from someone saying that they like the new interface. The old one was verbose and unwieldy, which I would agree with. And I would also make the point, for those who are not aware of it, part of the new clean interface's benefits is that it is mobile device friendly. So if you are walking around the stacks with a tablet or just your mobile phone, you can use the RDA Toolkit on that device, which would just not have been possible before. It is properly a digital resource rather than the sort of PDF based text that we had with the original toolkit. I had another thought in my head which has evaporated. It was to do with day-to-day cataloguing, but it'll come back to me later if it was worth sharing, I'm sure. Oh, that's what it was. In terms of implementation, the usage of the new RDA should bring some changes because we can say more specific things. For instance, the extension plan versus the mode of issuance in the past. But the implementation is not dated yet for most of us in the UK. Certainly my employer will implement the new RDA, but we don't yet have a date attached to that. And we probably, as with most institutions in the UK, will probably look to the British Library in terms of when we'll move on that. Alan's not here yet, Thurstan, so we should maybe leave that for him to talk about when he is able to join us in a wee while. So we'll leave implementation aside for right now, and instead I will bring the question Someone's asking, could you talk about the link between the RDA Toolkit and the RDA Metadata Registry? That's definitely one for you, Gordon.
Sure. I'll take the screen. Here we go. Sorry, I'm doing the usual fiddling around trying to get the menu bar at the top to get out of my way. The registry has just had an overhaul, although it looks pretty well the same as it did before at a superficial glance. There have been some significant changes. So the first thing is that the registry is now displaying the most up-to-date version of the RDA vocabularies. The RDA vocabularies is a GitHub project here. GitHub is a platform for version control and sharing software and data globally. It's completely open, so anybody can look and see what I have just clicked on. It's a menu item on the registry called project. And that takes you to the whole of the RDA vocabularies GitHub site, where there are various technical things which you can play around with. The most important thing is that there's a set of releases. The whole point about GitHub is that it doesn't delete anything ever. It keeps a copy of all of your changes as you make them. This means that any application that's using RDA vocabularies can roll back if they need to. So if release 4.0.2 contains something that breaks a local application, the local application can just roll back and re-download release 4.0.1 and carry on with that old release until such time as they amend their own application to fit the changes in the toolkits. So these releases, they're zip bundles. I'll go back to the registry. It's a zip bundle, and it contains the entire set of RDA vocabularies, which is virtually all of the content of the registry. The second point I'll make is the whole thing is on an open source license, a CC license, and this allows commercial reuse without permission. There is nothing to prevent the vendors using any of this because they do not require a license or any form of permission from the RSC to do so. All that is required is attribution. That's what by means. The main point here is that this data drives several applications, the most significant of which is RDA in many metadata formats, or RIMF, which some of you will know about. And there's a space on the registry where you can find out a bit more about RIMF. But the most important application that is driven by RDA vocabularies is the RDA Toolkit. The data that you see in the registry, if we go to the classes element set, you'll see here that work is defined as a distinct intellectual or artistic creation, etc. Then what you see here in the work entity is exactly the same. And in fact, it's sourced from the same place. So the first thing to say about the link between the registry and the toolkit is that all of the structured information in the toolkit, the element names, definitions, labels, their layout, their hierarchical organization, is all driven by the registry, which itself is driven by these RDA vocabularies. What we actually do in the data flow, and there is a diagram around which may need updated, so I'll be a bit wary about it. Or maybe we've removed it. We're updating some of this. And what actually happens is that if RSC decides it needs to, let's say, change this definition to a very distinct intellectual or artistic creation, blah, blah, then once it's all gone through the proposal, discussion and approval process from RSC, it's turned over to the technical committee and the RSC secretary, who updates this in a spreadsheet. So we actually do the updating in a Google spreadsheet. They make the change in that spreadsheet. And every so often, the changes are gathered together and they are uploaded into what we call the staff registry, which is completely invisible to everybody, including ourselves. It's a black box that is being run by our system developer. So we accumulate changes, we feed them into the staff registry ad hoc. And then when we're ready, we can take a download from the staff registry. That download itself is a zip file of the data. The data is all exported in resource description framework formats. So it's all native linked data and all of the non-linked data aspects of it are derived from that underlying linked data representation. From the staff registry, that data is then loaded here into the RDA registry. And then at the same time as it's loaded into the RDA registry, it is being loaded into the RDA Toolkit content management system. All the updating is carried out automatically, so the RSC editors do not have to intervene with this process. The changes made once, the word vary would be inserted in the spreadsheet, and that is the last time a human being is involved before you, the user, see it appear within the RDA toolkit. The whole thing is completely automated. So the element sets, the classes and the value vocabularies, these are the vocabulary encoding schemes. There's the one for carrier type. One big difference you'll note is that the toolkit does not contain deprecated data, so that is filtered out. But it's retained here for version control, etc., as I have mentioned earlier. The registry is aimed at developers. It is by no means aimed at end user catalogers. That's what the toolkit is for. So that's basically it. As well as these controlled resource description framework structured content, we also have a number of tools, as I said, they're being revised at the moment. But here you find maps. These are all actionable, machine actionable maps, semantic maps from RDA to related standards. The map from IFLA LRM, from the properties to IFLA LRM, which looks like this if you download it, except that was a foolish idea. It's changed itself into an RDF. That's because I have a particular thing set on my browser, which I will now set off. Those of you who are interested, follow what I'm doing. It's all on the recording. But there's a real neat add-on for Firefox called Open Link Structured Data Sniffer. That is a nice one. The trouble is it interprets CSV files, which are open data as open link data, and you can't open them up without a lot of fiddling. So if I've turned it off, if I now go and re-download this, it's now not interacting with it. And I can open up the data in Excel. And that's it. There's your mapping. There's your RDA compact URI. Yeah, your semantic mapping and the library reference model compact URI. All of this data is available to you for commercial re-exploitation without permission. That map and some of the other maps is used to drive some of the stuff you see here. So all of the data here in the element reference pop-up comes from the RDA registry and RDA vocabularies, including these alternate labels, etc. And here's the mapping to the LRM that I showed you, but it's been expanded out. It's active, it's clickable, and it takes you to the LRM namespace where you can find out more about this particular element as it is modeled within the LRM. The same goes for the mapping to Dublin core terms, and indeed the mappings to the Mark 21 bibliographic format. So all of that is stored in a structured way within the staff registry, the RDA registry, and then it's output for reuse and processing in the RDA toolkit. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you for that demonstration. The questioner says open source is amazing, and I would concur with that. Welcome to Alan Danskin, who has been able to join us now. Alan is also on our panel of experts, so we can get the benefit of his expertise too. We've been talking about some of our favourite features so far. It's only fair to talk about some of the challenges also. My concern as somebody who's going to be applying the toolkit is how to get my application profile set up, because it is understood that it's going to be helpful for each of us to come up with our own set of options and choices, and that would be held in an application profile. I had naively hoped that that would be something that would be part of the new toolkit, but that's not the case just now. However, I'm seeing potential benefits with the being not able to just take a bookmark, but I can take links and make a document that would create that. Do you have any hot tips for how best to think about application profiles? Gordon, Thurstan?
I can address some of this. The pandemic has interfered with things. I think this is one bit that we can definitely say the pandemic has had an interference with. So Alan is chairing an RSC application profiles working group, and I think it's an international working group. It was set up just at the start of the pandemic, and Alan can speak for himself, but it has delayed things, I think, by a clear year. The other comment I'd make, which is more addressed at you, Jenny, as a member of URIG, is that URIG promised us RSC that it would have a demonstrator application profile ready by February last year. And it was also delayed, and the latest I've heard from Renata is that they're still hoping to get something out by February this year. So I'm putting all of that down to the pandemic as well. Except there has been a very naive starting place, not from Alan and the other technical experts on the working group, but more generally speaking, and this came out of URIG, and I'm not casting aspersions on anybody. It's a fairly natural way of thinking. URIG thought that it could produce a single application profile that would do for the whole of Europe. It's a clear nonsense. I mean, the whole point about what we've done with RDA is there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all. Never has been. And all attempts to create such a beast in the past under the guise of universal bibliographic control have failed. What RSC has done with RDA is to produce a framework, not a mechanism, if I can put it that way. There's a subtle distinction, at least in my mind. What I see for application profiles, and this has been outlined in presentations over the past few years, which are available from the RSC website, is a series of building blocks that you might have, and these are just thoughts off the top of my head. We certainly explored this with RIMF, and RIMF actually has, RIMF 4 has some capabilities built into it already. So you might have a profile which just lists the minimum requirements for any catalog record. There's got to be a title. You've got to conform to RDA, which means that the minimum requirement for a description of any entity must include a human readable label for the entity. That's it. Plus, if it's a resource entity like a WEMI entity, it must include a link to at least one of the other resources that it's part of. Otherwise, there's no integrity left. So you can build up from, say, an application profile that says this is mandatory. The application would have to choose which of the human readable labels was mandatory. Is it going to be the name? Are you going to refer to me as Gordon Dunsire? Are you going to refer to me as Dunsire, Gordon, which is an access point? Are you going to refer to me, the record about me, using my social security number, my identifier? Or are you going to use my ORCID IRI? This is recording methods. You have to make that choice. We're going to go into this in much more detail in a specific webinar, maybe the next webinar we have in 2 weeks' time. We'll look into recording methods because they underpin every other decision that you're going to make about how to record stuff. So you can envisage an application profile being built up in layers. There is what's required by the British Library. The British Library has a certain amount of core expectations. They would be in its core AP. But then it may be that one of the university libraries requires more to be added to a catalogue record. See, it's like there's no such thing as a single CIP record in this scenario, right? There isn't a generally agreed, this will fit us all. Because I don't think that's going to hold over the next 5 to 10 years. Unless there are huge changes in OCLC and other suppliers like BDS, etc. Again, I'm not saying anything specific here, but things are going to change. So you can see application profiles, an application profile actually being composed of a set of other application profiles which fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. That's one approach. That's just one approach. Another approach is more of a top-down approach that everybody in the UK says, okay, we will sign up to this application profile that is, say, developed by the British Library, and everybody will sign up to that, and BDS will service that application profile under contract. And then we can all sit down and be happy. And that's going to be fine if everybody signs up to that. But the evidence isn't good. The evidence is not good. Every time.
We're all special, Gordon.
Yeah,
We're all special. We all need
I know that from 30 years of dealing with it. Every attempt to get beyond the obvious, you know, what you would call a CIP record, every attempt to get consensus on what a minimum standard, it fails. It's failed, it's failing, and apologies if I got this entirely wrong. Maybe somebody can shout at me. As far as I know, it's failing with the latest UK bookstore, union catalogue, whatever acronym it's called. Can somebody remind me?
I'm afraid I don't know off the top of my head.
The UK book thing. Union catalogue used to be called UCNUC for those of you with very old memories, or COPAC.
Oh, that's just Discovery.
Yeah.
What you're talking about.
There may be a minimum input standard for the bibliographic data held in the union file, but I'll guarantee that nobody can actually adhere to it. And if it's anything more sophisticated than CIP, then everybody's special, as you're saying, Jenny. Yeah. So I don't see this, and certainly no application profile community sees application profiles being actually used in this way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us actually have application profiles. It's just that we're not used to calling them that. Right. People who have labeled data entry forms, people who have, well, as BDS does, we have in-house checks when a record is saved, and it will tell you if there's a field missing that it should have, or if there's incompatible information between different fields. And those are in effect all part and parcel of an application profile. It's making sure the data fits certain rules. Yeah. I'm wondering what a natural jumping off point would be next. I don't have an immediate question other than we're planning to get back to Mark at some point later.
Can I do
Alan, what would you like to tell us?
I was just going to add a bit about application profiles.
Oh yes, sorry.
So yes, Gordon is correct that there has been a delay this year, not entirely attributable to lockdown, but it hasn't helped. So from what we've been looking at within the BL is how we would use an application profile. What would be the benefit of an application profile? I mean, we have, as Jenny's pointed out, we have application profiles within our Aleph system at the moment. They're called templates. And from my perspective, the thing that's kind of exercising me most about how we use the new toolkit is how we pull together the RDA instructions, our policies, and what we want catalogers to actually do. And I'm seeing the application profile as being part of that narrative, if you like, that it will provide the framework in which we recast our workflow documentation that we had previously provided for our own catalogers, but were also widely used outside of the library. So I'm seeing the application profiles as being quite useful as a prompt, in a sense, to say these are the things that should be here or could be here, and this is what you do to adhere to the levels of information we want to provide. So I mean, I've been impressed by the RIM 4 approach to this, and I think it's, from our perspective, I'm looking at a kind of set of generic properties that would apply to most or the vast majority of descriptions, regardless of content type or carrier type, and then thinking about what would we need for different content and carrier types, just to provide a sort of branching approach. And those are the kind of things that I would want to build into our own application profile, so that we've got an underlying framework that we can work from.
Yeah, I really like the way that the new toolkit's going to display policies from the likes of the British Library and Library of Congress alongside the relevant options. So you're not having to keep in mind as you flip backwards and forwards like the original toolkit asked you to. But we don't have that obvious methodology in the new toolkit of a shared workflow that the original toolkit had. So can we be optimistic that there will be shared documentation that we will be able to learn from?
It's in our plan.
Good.
To produce it. It's a substantial task.
Yeah.
It was a substantial task the first time around, and it hasn't got any easier.
Yeah, indeed.
I think
RSC does expect to publish some application profile templates, if you want to call it that.
Right.
As I said at the beginning of my comments, that there has been a somewhat naive attitude, and it's prevalent throughout the whole profession. I think it comes from ideas of UBC, etc., that I mentioned earlier, that it is simple, and we're actually all in agreement. We're just looking for what it is we've agreed on. And this is not true. But there may be some general. So initially, RSC had this idea that it might have in that community resources area a tab that a menu item that say application profiles. And as far as I know, something will start to appear under that moniker over the next 18 months or so. In that area of the toolkit, we have the infrastructure in place for this. And there was this idea, Eurig has been pushing for 3 years now, for reasons that are perfectly understandable, that Europe should adopt a European-wide application profile. The problem, as Jenny's alluded to, is every national library in Europe is exceptional. And I don't think they're going to get very far with deciding on the detail. However, I think it's perfectly feasible, as Alan's alluded to come out with some real basic stuff. The toolkit just has a completely open choice. It's completely neutral. There are bits of the toolkit that nobody would ever apply ever. They don't make any sense. But they're there just in case. They're there to provide integration. They're there to provide completeness. They're not, it's not this, if it's there, you've got to use it thing. It's another myth that people need to get trained out of, reorientated out of. If it's in the toolkit, it doesn't mean you have to use it. It should be the other way around. If it's in the application profile, you should be using it. That's going to be the general, I think, approach, say, in 5 years' time. But there may be some building blocks that RSC could develop in collaboration with the working group and with various communities like Eurig. So I've already mentioned some kind of minimum requirement for a description of a person, for example. It shouldn't be too difficult to organize, at which point RSC will probably publish that as a specimen application profile within the toolkit, but it will be within that community area, which means it's not official RDA. It's not maintained by the RSC. It has to be maintained mainly by community input. But we don't know where these things are going to go at the moment. It's far too early to tell. All we have is knowledge of the past. And I keep reiterating, in the past, every single attempt to get more than a economically bounded community to agree, that is a single funder like the University Grants Council, you know, or the National Library's funding arrangements, only through economic pressure has collaboration developed into accepting exceptionality beyond your natural level, if I can put it that way. And this is, to me, is the biggest issue facing not RDA, but cataloging in general, is trying to understand that you can make your data interact with other people's data if you design it in a certain way, but it's never going to be a substitute for it, for your own data. It's a global, local thing. What's good for the local is always going to be different from what's good for the global. What RDA attempts to do is say, whatever choice you make, whatever application you use within RDA, that data will interact and it will fit at some level between different communities. But if you want to maximize it within your community, you have to have an application profile yourself. So these are idle thoughts. We have recently published, I'll just show you this because people might not be aware of it. So I'll just take the screen back. In the registry, where this was just published 4 weeks ago, so you may not be aware of it. But there is this alignment, again, it's in the public domain, an alignment from the RDA elements and entities to the toolkit itself. And it's quite big. And what this does is it gives you the toolkit URL for every element in RDA. So you can create external documentation and put hyperlinks in. This is the toolkit URL for, demonstrate this live. For the element RDE EP20415. Now, I haven't the faintest idea what that element is. But if I enter the URL into my browser, or I clicked on it as a hyperlink, I find out it's Sensor Collective Agent. So we've done as much as we can to put stuff into the public domain. There's at least 5 people listening to this who are perfectly capable of some simple programming that could take all the data we've made available and create little mini work forms for your little library application. I used to do this all the time 30 years ago. You know, no serials module. You know, this is back in the day when integrated library systems didn't have serials modules. Or write your own, you know, something to track the ordering and receipt of serials. Lots of people were doing it then. You can start doing it again now because we've provided you the tools to do so.
Yeah, that's a really useful mapping. Thanks for drawing that one out. Yeah. Thurstan or Alan, do you want to say any more about application profiles just now?
I'd just like to say one thing while Gordon, when you were still just sharing the screen there, Gordon.
Yeah.
If you want to show the guidance section in the current tool, the new toolkit that deals with application profiles, and picking up on something you were mentioning earlier about minimum descriptions, the section within that discusses those, and also coherent descriptions.
Mm-hmm. What was it you wanted to know?
Well, it was just picking up on something you mentioned in passing relating to the really low bar effectively there is now for RDA implementation in terms of what is required. Yeah. There is documentation there about that. But since we're on this particular topic, I think it's also worth noting the issues around conformance as well, which has been one of the areas which the application profiles document covers. And we've been talking about application profiles up to now, but also certainly from the perspective of mark development, one of the big areas of discussion over the past few months has been, well, to what degree are existing record models compatible with the RDA, with new RDA in terms of conformance when we think about cardinality and those kind of issues. So again, you know, the application profiles guidance is a useful jumping off point to start thinking about those issues and to what extent the new RDA can be implemented.
Thank you for that, Thurstan. At risk of interrupting a good flowing conversation, I think we should have a very short comfort break since we're halfway through our session. So we will return in 5 minutes at 10 past. I'll pause the recording. Welcome back, everybody. We will get underway again. We've had a question in over the break, which means we're still going to talk about application profiles for a little bit longer. Someone asking how it might work with shared cataloging services if different users are working with different application profiles. And I think that's partly covered by what Thurstan was saying, in that there's a low bar in terms of what makes a coherent RDA record. But I think somebody more expert than I should take over answering the question. Alan, would you like to explain how the compatibility between different application profiles can be overcome?
Well, I think it's overcome because although people will be using different application profiles, all the application profiles are relating to RDA elements. And so, and they will be describing the elements or recording information about the attributes in one of the 4 ways that RDA prescribes. So whatever data you're creating under those circumstances is RDA data, and therefore it's valid and it is fundamentally compatible with RDA data created by other institutions, or people in other institutions.
Yeah, and presumably if it is a shared data service, there will be some...
One would imagine there would be some... So what I envisage, although one way in which this might work is that a community will have an application profile, and that community might be, for example, NACO or PCC or the British Library or whatever level of community you want to think about. Legal deposit libraries in the UK, there may be a sort of agreed application profile. Institutions can use that application profile, but they may want to add their own nuances to it. But at the core of it, it will be a shared application profile.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Where we can go next, we mentioned implementation before you were able to join us, Alan. Could you give us your thoughts in terms of implementation of the new toolkit, in terms of what timeframes you're thinking of?
Yeah, so we're looking into 2022 now. We're thinking it will be, we won't be implementing before the middle of 2022.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, as I already mentioned, there's a lot of documentation to write.
Yeah.
And really just being able to do all that, particularly in the current circumstances, has been quite difficult. It's so much easier to do that kind of thing when the people you're working with are all in the same room. But that hasn't been the case this year, and we've made quite good progress on documenting policy statements, but we've still got a lot of work to do in terms of getting those policy statements into the toolkit. And then the policy statements are then something that we can incorporate into our workflows when we start writing the workflow documents. We're also in the process of getting together sets of examples so that we've got examples that we can incorporate into the workflow documentation, marked up examples so that people can see how things should look. From our perspective, they'll be marked up with the Mark 21 as they are in the current examples in our current workflows.
Yeah. Yeah, examples is one of the parts of the new toolkit that still needs expanded. Is that the right word? Gordon, do you know what's hoped for in terms of getting more examples into the new toolkit?
Sure. Yeah, I'm on. First of all, the previous examples editor, Kate James, and the current examples editor have both said that they don't anticipate having examples on every page. It's not going to happen. We have had problems with examples in the past where, despite very clear statements to the effect that examples in the original RDA toolkit were illustrative and not prescriptive, there was still a certain amount of reluctance to treat them as such. And there was certainly pressure, I know, in the earlier days of the original toolkit to get more and more examples in there. With the 3R project, however, a number of other factors, came into play. One of them is that for the purposes of illustrating instructions, there is so much repetition of instructions in the new toolkit that it does not make any sense to illustrate every single one of them, because once you've illustrated one, you've basically illustrated the idea, and the purpose of examples is illustration, not prescription. So as you know, there's at least 1,600 elements in RDA that have the same set of instructions. The only thing that changes is the element name and context and hierarchy, but the actual instructions are basic unstructured description, basic structured description, basic identifier, and basic IRI. And because we use an awful lot of repetition for various reasons, the RSC agreed that there shouldn't be examples saying the same thing, just with different examples. on every possible element. So that's the first point to make. The second point to make is that they are still under development, as has been stated. The examples editor is adding more examples in with each release, but there are a number of bigger issues. We're still looking at reworking those whole examples. So although there are a number of what are called view in context examples within the toolkit, where one element is illustrated by being embedded in what looks much more like a, you know, a normal metadata description set. That's still being worked on. The guidance chapters have a lot of embedded examples in them. That is the ones that were transformed from the original toolkit. There were still quite a few examples embedded in it. These were left over from AACR2. The jury is still out as to whether they will be given the same treatment as the full-blown example. I should explain that the examples are maintained using the same infrastructure as the whole toolkit, but in a separate functioning area of that. There's good reasons to separate the examples out from the text. Examples don't get translated as the primary one.
Yeah.
So they are maintained using exactly the same techniques as the rest of the toolkit, but they have their own special area. And the result is there are certain aspects of the markup that are exclusive to examples that are not used on the other content. That means actually that there's no, in practical sense, we only actually see the examples in context when they appear in the release of the toolkit itself. So I know that the examples editor is expecting, now that the toolkit is published, that there's going to be more pressure to put more examples in, which is exactly what this topic is about.
Yeah.
So she's expecting to be requested for more examples, but there will be probably an enhanced statement prepared, which goes over the points I'm making here. They are not prescriptive, they're illustrative, they cannot be ubiquitous, there is no point in repetition, and that they are non-translatable. What we expect to happen, and this is the reason for having this separate but compatible infrastructure, at least with the flexibility is there. There's not an expectation, but the flexibility is there for examples to be embedded within policy statements. So there's one route.
Yeah.
If the British Library or the Library of Congress feels that they need to add more examples, and the examples editors say, well, no, because, you know, of the sheer size of it, then there's nothing to prevent the policy statement writers who are using the same infrastructure. So the policy statements are also maintained using the same infrastructure. There's nothing to prevent them, you know, pulling over examples or creating their own within the examples infrastructure. We don't know what's going to happen with full translations yet, although there's Hungarian and Finnish in the current new toolkit. They are not complete translations. They're 90% complete, but I'm not sure what they've done with any examples. So I don't know whether there's Finnish and Hungarian examples. I simply haven't looked. So that's another route. That means actually, if you're clever, since all translations are available to all subscribers, if you're clever, you might find examples in a translation. If there are no examples and you really need to see an example in the English, then try the other translations. You can flick them on at a switch and see if they've come up with something. So there are various ways. I think the only sure thing is what I've stated. There is not going to be examples for every page. Examples will not be repeated unnecessarily, and they will remain illustrative only. And beyond that, I think communities, translators, and RSC can get together and come out with whatever is required. If those examples need to be in the toolkit, there are at least two places to put them: policy statements, community resources. There's nothing to prevent community examples going into community resources, but RSC will not maintain them for good reasons.
Yeah, I think there's a good argument for having examples, many examples in the community resources side of things. I also fully take on board what you're saying about avoiding repetition and illustrative, not prescriptive. That makes total sense. Really like the idea of there being fuller examples of RDA data. I hesitate to call them full bibliographic records because that's not necessarily RDA data approach, but certainly it'd be good to see more comprehensive sort of examples of a resource's RDA data rather than just selective fields.
As you know, one of the things that coming off RSC does for me is gives me a lot more time to work with TMQ on the development of RIMF and RBALS. So the RBALS website hasn't been touched since the 3R project started. I was recently in conversation with TMQ, the Mark of Quality, about this. And they've been quietly working on conversion routines from RIMF 3 to RIMF 4, which is essentially converting from RDA 2.73 to RDA 4.0.1. I don't know how far they've got. It's something I'll be looking at with them at the end of the month. But one of my goals here is to revive the RBALS website, which is chocker with RDA examples in pure RDA format. That might not be what people want, but certainly I think there's going to be an awful lot more examples of RDA available later in this year in the form of those worked RBALS. I'm also working with them on it's mainly their effort in producing some training materials for the cataloguing of aggregates and serials, which I mentioned earlier are the big change. And I think orientation and training materials are desperately needed in that area. So Deborah Fritz, who used to be the chair of the aggregates working group, has been working mainly herself, but with some consultation from me, on a whole series of self-paced training presentations that will take you through the cataloguing of aggregates, etc. So that they'll be full of examples as well. So I wouldn't be too concerned at our RSC's policy. I think it's there for very good reasons. It's really up to the communities to come out with the examples they want. And I can see, and I'm quite happy for us to discuss this within a UK setting. If the UK wanted to build up, UKCoR wanted to build up an examples database, then we could do it using RIMF 4 and easily publish it. Either ask RSC to publish it within community vocabularies, we're a community, or indeed put it onto a separate website and take it from there. So there's a lot of exciting possibilities here once the dust settles and once people are orientated, you know, to the new.
And I'll join my voice to yours and Alan's and say RIMF 4 is a really great place to play around in terms of getting to grips with the data modelling and a better understanding of how the entities work together.
Yeah, it's completely in sync with the new toolkit. It's on release 4.0.2 as well, so they're completely in sync.
Yeah. Question here asking, is there a firm commitment to the toolkit URLs, especially for elements being persistent, to support any external documentation that is written?
The worst thing you can do to destroy a product's branding and reputation is to go and break links deliberately. So the answer is no, they're not going to change. It would be economic suicide for ALA Publishing to now change those URLs. We've published them. They're out there. Yeah. You know, the worst possible thing would be in 2 weeks' time for somebody to turn around and say, I just spent 2 weeks building up this elaborate application profile and now half the links don't work. It's not going to happen. There's a total commitment to the link data ethics and professional practices surrounding RDA. And one of those, I showed you on the registry earlier, we never delete anything. We deprecate things, but we never delete anything. And you can regard those, oh no, the recording's on, I'll be very cautious here. Those URLs are a form of URI. All URLs are URIs. They identify or they refer to that document, which was the RDA instructions for the element. That's a document, a web document. It's not the element. So what we've done is we've linked an element to its documentation. And again, in standards practice, you never go and break those links. If you can
I think that's as much assurance as anybody can.
That's all I can say. If it were to happen, and I would remove my name from RDA, I would ask for all traces of me to be removed. It is such a no-no. Yeah. In linked data. So I understand why the question's there, because all too often in the past, communities have, you know, idly broken links, etc. We said during 3R not to trust any of those links, not to trust the bookmarks, not to trust the citation numbers, because they were all open to change.
Well, it was in beta.
That ceased on December the 15th. At that point, all of those things become solid. If they are changed, they are changed with extreme reluctance and for very, very good reasons. And I would hope that ALA Publishing and RSC would give loads of publicity to any such change if it had to happen in the future.
Great, thank you. I don't have any more questions from the floor, as it were, at the moment. I'm just looking at our list. Is there any prospect still of a relational navigation tool, or is that unlikely to happen now that 3R project's complete?
I said I'd answer this one. So this is kind of a reference to the relationship matrix, I think. Yeah. That there are been several presentations made about plans, including some screen mock-ups, I think. I'll just share my screen. So the idea for the idea was that we would have a place in the toolkit. I'd better go back to the beginning. So one of the very first things that was done with the 3R project is there was a focus group of users set up. And they were asked various questions by professional experts. It's something we contracted in. And one of the clear messages that came out of that initial study was that users of RDA Toolkit really wanted more context. The context of the elements and the entities, how they fitted together, because there seemed to be an idea with the old toolkit that you were only ever looking at part of the elephant, you know, the tree trunk part, or the, you know, the leather handbag part or whatever. And the bigger picture was much more difficult to see. So that drove an awful lot of the design decisions from then on in. So one of the ideas was that we could produce a graphical representation of the element set. In fact, there's nothing to prevent anybody from doing this. It's all in the public domain, and there are a number of graphic RDF converters out there that people could use to produce the kind of effect that we were looking for. And that would be that you could focus on an element, and it would be a kind of visual thing that would appear somewhere up here in the screen, a little diagram. And it would be RDF graphs. So the element would be in a blob. And then it would tell you what its parent element was up here, what its narrower elements were down here, what its domain was out here, what its range was out here. And then you could click on, say, the range, which might be work, and then you would get a blob called work in the middle, and then it would, because it's a class, it would tell you what the superclass was, RDA entity, what the subclasses were, there aren't any. And then there would be something that you could click on, and then it would list all of the attributes and relationships. ALA Publishing worked on this for the 3 years of the 3R project, during which time 2 of the consultancy companies, the design consultancy companies that they were using, were absorbed into bigger organizations. This is the nature of the beast. ALA Publishing likes to work with small, nimble, innovative software development companies. The trouble is, if they're successful, they get bought up by bigger guys, and then that nimbleness is lost. And that's happened here. Also, the prices kept going up and up and up with each absorption. So ALA Publishing asked RSC if it could delay implementation of this to some unspecified point in the future when finances would be better and the landscape would be clearer. That's the current situation. It has not been abandoned. It has been delayed, basically marked and parked. And I'm not thinking anything as much is going to happen for at least 18 months to 2 years, because the focus is going to be on all the other things we've been discussing in this webinar.
Yeah.
The question then is does this cause operational problems? And we have been able to alleviate, I think, what most of the issues were. And in particular, in the last 6 months, the list of elements at the end of an entity, that display has been made smarter, as you all know. We've got real problems with the ergonomics here. There are 3,000 plus elements, and they're in poly hierarchies, so there's not even a single mono hierarchy for them. The reason is that there are 2 hierarchies within the entities. There's the agent hierarchies, and then there is the RDA entity hierarchy above all the other entities. So the initial monolithic list of all the elements associated with work, that's been made smarter, as you now know, and that you can isolate just the attribute elements. And see, this I think is a good listing of how you know, what the parameters are to describe a work. These are all descriptive elements. But you can also filter now by the relationship elements. So you can get part of that relationship matrix effect because you can isolate the work to family relationships, for example. And this is pretty well the functionality that we were looking for with that visual representation. It's just not visual. And secondly, it is not all connected. So this bit only, you have to get to it via going to the work entity. It's the same for the other entities. There is no hierarchy. That's what's missing here. So there is nothing to say what the relationship between author family and book artist family is, if indeed there's anything, any relationship at all. That data appears when we get there at the end of each of the element sections, where you can see, and here's the poly hierarchy. This element has two higher, broader elements, not one. And it has four narrower elements, and it has an inverse. So this gives you the immediate neighborhood of the element, but it doesn't give you a huge overall picture. And that is what we were looking for with that navigation aid. So what's missing is, in one place, a display of all of the elements in their correct context with each other, and within each element, a display of all of its, with each entity, a display of all of its elements in context and in hierarchies. That functionality has never been present in RDA anyway. So it's not as though we've taken something away, we have just failed to complete that little extra thing. I have to say personally, for me, it was the most exciting thing that we were doing in 3R, this visual representation. I was very, very disappointed at the outcome, but functionally, it makes very, very little difference in my opinion. You can still get the hierarchies, you still get the context. You may have to click 2 or 3 times to do so.
Yeah, I agree that it's not necessary. It would have been really nice. I think it would also be quite a useful training tool. But as you say, there are other ways of getting that. It's just, it would be nice to have it within the toolkit.
If a community or an individual, as I said, all this data is in the public domain. There's nothing, and those software packages are in the public domain. If an enthusiastic member of UKCoR was to come up with something that we could perhaps collaborate on working on, and it looks really nice, then maybe ALA Publishing would thank us. It's a great deal. But we have to organize that for ourselves. You know, with limited funding. I guess another way of answering the question is, yeah, ALA Publishing can put this visual relationship matrix into the toolkit tomorrow, but the subscription price is going to go up by 10%.
Yeah, that wouldn't be a popular move.
So it's a balancing act. It's disappointing, but the data's all there. Nothing's missing. It's just slightly clumsy to get at it, and it's no more clumsy than the original toolkit was. In fact, I think the original toolkit was a bit of a mess from that point of view. So yeah, it's a horses for courses thing, I think.
Thank you. More questions arising are more to do with the mark side of things. We're sort of running out of time slightly to talk expansively about mark development, Thurstan has prepared material on talking about mark development and how it might accommodate various aspects of new RDA. Thurstan, we've only got 15 minutes left, so I would rather not squeeze all that you have to say into that. We have other webinars coming up where we can talk more expansively about mark and as it deserves, but we did have a question earlier about showing how the how the mark tag searching worked. So could you give us a quick demonstration of your the mappings and how you can find?
Sure. Yeah, so I'll just share my screen, okay?
Yes, please.
Right. Okay, so you should see the toolkit there.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So if, for example, I want to search for field 245 in the Mark 21 bibliographic format, $A, then basically you can use the search box and in speech marks, enter the tag and the subfield like so, and click that. And then you will see the different elements in which the 245 $A is referenced. And because, as we know, the Mark bibliographic format is effectively a flat conflation of the WEMI entities, that's why you get references for title of work, expression, manifestation, and item, as well as title proper. And if you click through to title proper, then you will find the Mark bibliographic mapping at the bottom of the element reference section here, and then you can expand that. And you can note that using that, you can create you can enter a value for the title proper using an unstructured description, using that recording method. So that's one search. Now I'll show you a way to search specifically on an indicator value. So I'm going to look for 264 second indicator 1. And as you can see, again, using that combination in the speech marks, you get a list of hits for publisher related elements that can be recorded in the Mark 264 field with second indicator 1. If I change that to second indicator 2, yes, there you get results relating to distribution rather than publication, which is a reflection of the fact that you've got the second indicator 2 value there rather than the 1. And if you put in second indicator 3, then you go to manifestation. So that's a very brief demonstration of the functionality for searching for mark tags.
Thank you, Thurstan. I think you just made a lot of people's day. We are so used to...
Always good to hear.
We are so used to thinking in mark, whilst we know it's not the ideal format for realising all the joys of RDA. It is still where most of us are at, and consequently it, as I say, is still largely how we think. So being able to not only see that there are mappings, but also that we can very directly search on what we know now in order to find out what we need to know in RDA is really, really helpful, I think.
Mm-hmm. One thing I should say is that the mappings are still undergoing development. Obviously, there is going to be a lag in terms of the mappings from any changes that take place to the MARC standards and then getting those into the toolkit. And we know that there are various other aspects in terms of decisions that need to be made around some of the new elements that the new toolkit introduces. So they are not complete, but we've made significant progress over the past year or so in terms of porting over mappings from the old toolkit into the new one, and starting the process of mapping those new elements.
Fantastic.
And also breaking them down according to recording method as well. Yeah, really useful. And as I've mentioned already, there's lots more to talk about with respect to MARC, so we'll give that due space in subsequent webinars. I must correct, Gordon earlier said that we were having the next webinar in a couple of weeks' time. It's actually 3 weeks. So hopefully many of you will join us again for the webinar on the 6th. Yeah, the next one's on the 5th of February. So we'll make sure that we get a good portion of time to explore how the new RDA implementation would work in MARC and what is happening with MARC development to enable that. Thanks, Thurstan. Gordon and Alan, we're getting to the last sort of portion of the webinar. Is there anything you'd like to mention or revisit that you think has not necessarily had its due this afternoon?
I missed the beginning, so I don't really know what I missed.
Well, you could tell us what you like best about the new toolkit.
Right. Well, I wondered if that was a question. I think what I like about it is its openness and inclusivity, which, from my personal professional perspective, is very important because of the things I'm trying to do at the British Library. But the fact that we can be very tolerant of different types of legacy data, and it's still RDA, that we can be tolerant of data coming from digitized sources and manipulated by machines, but it's still RDA. And we can accept data that's been created in another language and to a different set of cataloging traditions, but it's still RDA, and it will all interoperate at some level, and generally quite a reasonable level, I would say. That seems to me to be a tremendous leap forward. And it's a complete change of mindset about saying, well, we can't accept that because it's not good enough. Yeah. We can accept that, and we can say that it's we can achieve certain things. It may not achieve everything that we want, but it's a basis on which we can build.
Agreed. And that seems like a very nice point to wrap up this afternoon, unless anybody has any last minute.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, Jenny, is just to explain to the audience that this is a kind of new approach that we're taking here, this kind of rambly, no agenda.
I don't think we're rambling too much.
Well, I don't mean rambling in your classic Scottish sense. I mean rambling in your classic Scottish sense. You know, seeing where the landscape takes you, let's put it that way. Yeah. Occasionally picking the odd piece of ripe fruit. I I've enjoyed this. I think this has been quite successful, and I think certainly the panelists will improve things a bit better for the next webinar. But the audience has its part to play, and now that the audience has seen the kind of thing we're trying to do, I would just encourage you to submit questions in advance if you can. It does help us prepare, but we're supposed to be experts, so we're supposed to be able to answer questions on the fly. So they're just as acceptable. And I'll just finally reiterate what Jenny's already said. It needs to be said over and over and over again. There is no such thing as a stupid question about RDA. There absolutely isn't. Even if you were to say, what does RDA stand for? Is that a stupid question? It's not a stupid question. I could talk for 2 hours on what those 3 words mean. That's me. You know what I'm like. So there's no such thing as a stupid question. You've got 3 weeks to think about this. You've got 3 more weeks during lockdown to play with RDA. Please, please submit questions, or submit as good questions as you did this time round during the session next time round.
Thank you. I think all that remains for me to do then is to say thank you very much, Gordon, Thurstan and Alan, for sharing your time and expertise with us this afternoon. And I look forward to doing it all again, but better, in 3 weeks' time.
Thank you for hosting, Jenny. Excellent hosting.
No problem. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.